don't know where things were located, but it is not 55. Oh, they fixed it. It said it was 55 degrees. I wish. All right, welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started for today. So we're now in week 6, which is about halfway through the quarter. So we're definitely moving right along and making some really good progress. Appreciate those of you that are here face to face or able to join us through Zoom. Thanks for coming by. Before we get started, I just want to give you a couple updates. First of all, I mentioned that my goal was to give you the grades and feedback on your first writing assignment on Friday. Unfortunately, I needed to wait for a couple more assignments that still had to be turned in. I like to turn around feedback once I get everybody's assignment submitted. Thankfully, I was able to get the last one this morning, so I should be able to get just the feedback and all of that uploaded for you by the end of the day to give you some time to prepare and use it for your essay assignment in the class. So I apologize for the delay. Again, I just try to universalize it and get it back once everybody's turned it in, and you just need to wait a little bit of time to do that. So the other thing is Lily had a question about sending along a rough draft or outline related to the essay assignment and when the latest could be to do that. So if you want to send me a rough draft or outline or meet with me in office hours for preparing for that assignment, you're welcome to do that. The latest time that I could accept a rough draft to turn around feedback would be on Friday. So that's pretty close to the deadline. So you wouldn't have a whole lot of time to incorporate feedback, but I would be able to do so if you sent it to me on Friday. So just to give you a bit of flexibility there as you're working through it. And again, sending me an outline or rough draft is optional. It just could be a way to help you in your grade or just to get feedback if you're anxious about part of the assignment. So I just wanted to put that on your radar. So what I want to do for today is to start with a prompt that'll be part of your attendance credit for the day, but it's going to directly link to a lot of the things that we'll be going over. So far in the class, we've been talking about listening in a lot of different situations. For instance, how to connect to things like culture and gender, with that idea of rhetorical listening. You all shared last week some of your own perspectives and identities and the ways that those could connect to communication. And this week, we're getting into a kind of fun topic in thinking about what it means to listen in the context of political and social issues, right? Oftentimes we feel like we're not listening to each other, we're really divided, and we have a lot of difficulty, like we get really tense when we find ourselves in political or social disagreements with one another. So this class is really about helping us to understand and think about how listening impacts these divisions and discussion. I think it's important and timely stuff to think about. To get us started and to kickstart a lot of this discussion, as part of your attendance for today, I want you to write or type, thinking back to a time that you listened to somebody and you found yourself disagreeing with maybe the ideas or thoughts that that person was bringing in. Perhaps it was listening to a friend, a family member, a casual acquaintance, somebody that you know, and so on. What I want you to do is try to put yourself back into that situation and imagine when you were listening to that person. How well did you listen? Did you follow closely, or did you find that you pretty largely tuned out of the conversation? And then secondarily, I want you to think a little bit about how you felt at the time that you were listening. For instance, maybe you felt especially tense or seized up, maybe you felt bored, or maybe you just felt like a little bit annoyed, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can think about that, right? For instance, I was listening to a friend who was talking about how cool they thought cryptocurrency and NFTs were. They just went on and on and on about it. And I did not feel the same. I was not a very big fan. And I felt like as I was listening to that person, I started to tune out to focus on other things. And I kept checking my phone to see when they would stop talking. So that's an example, right, of not agreeing, but feeling like your listening has changed based on this. I'll give you a couple more minutes to think through this if you're still working. I'm not going to ask you to share this part, but you can start to use this to think about things we'll be going over for today. Go ahead and wrap up the current thought or idea that you're writing. So this was kind of a brainstorming exercise, an opportunity for us to start to think about some of the challenges that we feel when we're listening to perspectives and issues that we disagree with, right? Some of the ways that we listen is oftentimes not well. For instance, we'll do safeguards or mental blocking, where we find ourselves on a topic we disagree with, and in order to protect ourselves, we tune out. We hear signals, for instance, maybe the political or social affiliation or language choices that somebody makes as an indicator that we're kind of shutting down and not really hearing out that person's perspective.
Or at times, we might intently listen if we're trying to gain strategy or perspective on somebody that we really disagree with, right? That's something we'll get into a little bit more for today, that oftentimes we will listen pretty closely to people that we disagree with because we want to understand from a strategic perspective what somebody is saying. And we can feel a combination of things when we listen to people we disagree with. For instance, we might find ourselves like seizing up and feeling really tense. We might find ourselves feeling bored. We might find ourselves feeling curious, right, and wanting to understand. But in any case, these are some major issues for us to think about. Is what does it mean to listen to other people when we find ourselves disagreeing with the content of the message, or maybe with the person that's giving the message, right? So we'll hit on some of those things in a moment and do a preview of this week's reading. But before we do that, just as a quick reminder from last week, we were looking at listening as it applies to issues including gender and culture, using the piece on rhetorical listening. Again, this was kind of a useful framework for us to think about what it means to listen, thinking about culture. And we also talked a little bit about the listening assignment. As a reminder, the first essay is due by this Sunday. It's about 4 pages or more, double-spaced, standard font and margins. I am asking you to cite from at least 2 readings within the course. Remember that there are 3 different prompts to choose from. I definitely recommend by the end of the day today, if you haven't already done so, to pick one of the 3 prompts that you're choosing. Remember, you should just pick one of them for this assignment. And they relate to different parts of the quarter. If you found yourself really interested, engaged on issues of professional listening, you might focus on that, and so on. So I definitely recommend choosing the prompt that really stands out to you and following the guidelines closely. As I mentioned earlier, send me a draft or outline by the end of the day on Friday, and I'll be happy to add that on for you. I've also gone ahead and added the extra credit for folks that did the activity on Canvas. So last Monday, I sent out a Canvas announcement, and in that I included a word. If you emailed me that word by that Friday, I added extra credit. So thank you all for those of you that were able to do that. And just as a reminder, right, to regularly check your email and so on for active listening and following along. There will be another extra credit assignment later in the course. So if you missed it, that's okay. You'll still have that additional opportunity to catch up. Last class, we talked again about these 3 different steps of rhetorical listening. We've gone over them at this point kind of ad nauseum, so I'm not going to do it again. But again, rhetorical listening is about how we understand who we are, how we take responsibility for our listening, and how we use this idea of identification. What do we have in common? What is different as a way to engage with other people? This idea of identification, of figuring out that we're both similar and different to other people in a lot of different ways and acknowledging that space is definitely going to be an important thing that we'll be exploring for this week. So we'll be talking about political and social issues and the ways that they relate to the issue of listening. In particular, we'll be applying and thinking about the idea of the public sphere and the way that the public sphere has connected to listening. How many folks have heard the phrase public sphere used before, looking in another class or situation? So like, not super common. That's okay. That's an idea that we're going to be building on and talking about for this week. So this week's article, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's not a super long reading. In fact, it's only about 12 or 13 pages of content, right? And I think it's pretty straightforward in the ideas that it lays out. Comes from a few authors, the main one being Dr. Carolyn Hendricks, who comes from the Crawford School of Public Policy. And Hendricks comes in from kind of a political theory, political science background, but is really interested in the ways that we listen and communicate with one another across these political and social differences. So she actually wrote a book about the politics of public deliberation and how we, right, as people engaging within a society, address and talk about some of the issues of the day. As we'll explore for this class, a lot of the history and context surrounding communication and listening as it applies to a broader society operates under the assumption that when we listen and hear out and debate with one another, that we'll be able to reach the right conclusion or to reach a good perspective. And that's been challenged, as you can probably imagine, in light of a lot of recent ways that political and social discussion has gone. But I think that that ideal and that principle that was held at the time is a useful way of thinking about the challenges and the reasons that we have them in the present. Again, this week's reading is Listening in Polarized Conversations, a study of listening practices in the public sphere. And that reading, again, is available on Canvas for you to work on. Again, each week I like to offer the sort of central thesis or argument that's presented in that article. This week's central thesis is the idea that we need to better understand listening as it applies to a lot of social and political issues. As we've explored a lot in the corridor, right, there are a lot of situations where listening is kind of assumed within an area, but it isn't actually explored or discussed as a topic. For instance, if you're working for a business or a company or nonprofit or some type of organization, there's an assumption that you need to be a good listener. But as we talked about in class, we don't really know how to measure what good listening is, or there's been very little work to actually apply or think about what listening would mean in those situations. We just assume to be a listener. So in the same way, on these kind of public topics and issues, we need to better think about listening. And listening to both supportive groups, that is, groups that share your perspectives and ideas on an issue, and listening to groups that are opposing, that are very different, or that are very diametrically opposed to what you believe in, are both important functions, but they tend to function for different reasons than we might expect. That is, we can listen to people who support us, and oftentimes that gets stereotyped as an echo chamber, but it actually does a lot of good. And we can listen to people who disagree with us, not just because we're trying to argue or debate with them, but because it helps us to develop strategy, to think about how to listen effectively. So we'll be exploring a lot of these ideas. I want to show you, this comes from the Pew Research Center, which has done a lot of research and discussion over the years on a lot of political issues. And one of the things that they measure is this idea of political polarization. How many people have heard the term polarization or heard discussions of political polarization? Yeah, so a number of you. I think, right, there's a lot of issues with the ways we talk about or think about polarization, right? So, there's a lot of question about whether or not people are actually drifting more or less on one side of the ideological spectrum. So I'm not here to say, oh, we as a country, conservatives have gotten more conservative and liberals have gotten more liberal. I don't know that that's a fair assumption for me to make. I'm not a political scientist. What I do know is that we statistically identify greater division among political parties and perspectives than we've definitely seen in the past, right? If you search between 1994, right, where blue is marked as people that identify as a Democrat or liberal, red as people that mark as Republican or conservative, and this kind of darker color marking people that are moderates or somewhere in between, right? We can definitely see that there are greater swaths that are much more on one side or consistently affiliated with a political party or orientation. And the number of folks that are in the middle have definitely shrunk, right? And I'm not here to say that that's a good or a bad thing, but just to suggest that when there's these greater levels of division, or at the very least we perceive greater division on these issues, that it's going to cause us to react to differing perspectives and points of view very differently. I think it's fair to say, right, that especially in recent years, it is a lot more difficult to talk to somebody with whom you share significant social or political disagreements, right? And understanding and unpacking why those disagreements happen and why those disagreements can feel a lot more taxing and charged is a really key point for us to think about. Polarization generally means, right, that people are more likely to move to opposite positions on an issue. So it's not necessarily that each group gets more extreme, just that there is a greater gulf of points of view on issues. For instance, they've also done measures of political parties and what they list as most important values. And those lists of values have changed pretty substantially and are now very different in many situations, depending on party. Polarization, right, also means that we are more likely to perceive outsiders or people occupying a similar or a different point of view, politically or socially, a lot more negatively, right? That if we see greater distance between ourselves and somebody else, we're more likely to think about them in a negative way. There's a lot of reasons for this, right? The feeling that the other side is too extreme, the feeling that outsiders might pose a greater threat. Those are some of the reasons, and just a fear of or lack of understanding of difference. And what polarization also means, right, is that there's fewer individuals who occupy a space in between these perspectives. As you noticed from the chart a minute ago, right, the number of moderates, or identified moderates, has shrunk. So more and more people occupy one of those positions that, again, are a lot more separated. Polarization, right, can have a lot of consequences. And this is definitely something we've seen, but also something that's not limited to the United States, right? We can think about a lot of political and social organizations where the parties have definitely had greater levels of disagreement with one another. One idea, again, this is drawing a little bit from political science, that's actually a good way of thinking about some of the divisions that we have. So a lot of people have had concern or raised issues with the two-party system in the United States, right? A lot of people will say, I don't like the system. I don't think it makes sense for there to be these two parties that are kind of opposed. And certainly, right, there's definitely populations and individuals who are independent or identify outside of these two major parties, right? So I want to recognize that. And, you know, you do end up getting people such as elected leaders who might identify as independents, right? There are 2 US senators in the United States that are politically identified as independents, for instance. But this idea in political science is known as Duverger's law. And Duverger's law states that in a winner-take-all system, you're more likely to have 2 parties. The reason for that is, you know, in the United States, the party or the candidate that receives a plurality of votes, for instance, somebody running for Senate or House, or within a state in the Electoral College, right, would win. And as a result of that, it's about trying to get the most votes in support. You're more likely to have all these different groups consolidated in order to create a single party, right? It is more strategic for you to merge or to join a party or candidate because then that candidate is more likely to win, right? That's why a lot of times in political primaries, we see this sort of merging of political differences and views, right? If you think back to probably one of the tightest primaries in US history, right? The Democratic primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, they ended up having to consolidate support, and a lot of Clinton supporters turned to supporting Obama in the general election, right? That's very different from other political systems, such as the British political system, which is proportional representation. In other words, there are a lot more parties in countries such as many Western European countries because it's not about the party that gets the most votes or the most support, because they measure it by percentage of political party. In other words, you'll have political parties that maybe only get like 12% of the vote, but they proportionately will get that amount of seats represented. That's why you'll have things like the Pirate Party that actually end up getting seats in a chamber, because even though, yes, they only got like 3% of the vote, that still means that they get a proportion or share of representatives. So all this to say, right, that the structure of voting and of the winner-take-all system in the US incentivizes having two major political parties, right? And as a result of that, we oftentimes experience issues related to polarization, that we feel hostility for people outside of our group or bubble. And it can also become more challenging to listen to or to understand opposing groups, in part because they might be perceived as a threat, in part because we might feel frustrated because of how much we disagree, or times it feels like we're speaking an entirely different language, right? There's the classic trope of, you're having a family meal for a holiday, like maybe like Thanksgiving, right? You find yourself talking with relatives with whom you strongly disagree. That's an example, right, of feeling that polarization in action. Another key idea here that I think really closely ties to the issues that are brought up in this article, and I think are really worth discussing, is the idea of different spheres. So if you've taken a class in rhetoric or you've taken a class in public speaking, these are things that get talked about in a little bit more detail. But to help with providing context and information here, when we speak or when we communicate or when we listen to one another, there's three major avenues in which we do so. The private sphere is what you consider to be a conversation with somebody that's really close to you, such as a family member or close friend. It can also be an inner dialogue, right? So if you're playing music and pumping yourself up in the morning on the way to work, or you're doing something that involves talking to yourself or reflecting, like your inner voice or conscience, that would be the private sphere. The technical sphere, right, would be groups that are based on exclusion and specific membership. So if you're a member of ASDOU and you attend those regular meetings, right, then you would be a member of a technical sphere. If you're part of a club or activity on campus, that's also the technical sphere, right? You're somewhere in between where it's not everybody, but it is a group of people with whom there's regular interaction. And then the public sphere is this idea that there's this open forum, this open exchange. This is basically a large or public audience. It can involve, for instance, a city, town, or the use of mass media, right? Of messages intended for a very broad public. If you find yourself getting a YouTube ad while you're trying to watch a video, right? That ad is directed toward a public sphere, albeit probably with algorithms and so on that are meant to target you specifically. So the public sphere, this broad audience that is a part of discussion and listening, right, is one of the core ideas that's being drawn from in order to understand this reading. And the idea of the public sphere comes from a German philosopher, a member of the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas, right? Habermas is famous or perhaps infamous for his perspectives surrounding the public sphere and the core assumption that a crucial element of democracy or democratic participation is that we have this open forum or setting in which people can meet and discuss issues. He talks about this in his book, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, right? The public sphere then is a way for people to openly communicate on social and political issues, to discuss or deal with the issues of the day, to reach a conclusion on issues, to deliberate, and ultimately, right, Habermas comes from the perspective that democracy will win the day, or at the end of the day, the truth shall emerge from our discussion. This goes all the way back to the Greeks, right? And the assumption that dialectic or dialogue or engagement with one another will ultimately lead us to the truth. And I'm kind of chuckling because that's not where we find ourselves now, right? Because oftentimes we find ourselves talking, debating, listening to one another, but not necessarily arriving at a conclusion or endpoint that's a good one. There's a lot of reasons for this, right? But one of the challenges, and I think one of the major drawbacks of thinking about the public sphere, is that it wasn't originally theorized or thought of for everybody. In fact, Habermas developed the public sphere as the idea of a bourgeois public sphere, or a public sphere that was meant for the elite or meant for the rich, right? It was in many ways kind of like an oligarchy almost, that you had these like elites that were supposed to be the ones that had decisions. So already the public sphere was sort of built on exclusion and lack of participation from the public. So these are important drawbacks and challenges to think about, that as we live currently, we do not see a world in which people are able to hash out or discuss their differences and then lead to the best outcome. It happens sometimes, right? It happens in some situations where it feels like people can really learn from or grow from one another. But oftentimes, political and social disagreements feel reductive. We're like taking shots and jabs at each other. We're not really changing each other's opinions. We're just reinforcing our existing beliefs. So the public sphere, just as a concept, has been kind of heavily scrutinized. Another key idea and a really big reason for this is coming from Dr. Kevin DeLuca, who is an environmental communication expert and discusser of the role of media in communication. Theorized the idea of the public screen, that we've transitioned in many ways thanks to social media, the internet, all of that good stuff, even television, from a public sphere where people talk about and hash out issues, to the ways that media shapes and impacts how we talk about social and political issues. Side note, media is a plural word. So pet peeve of mine is hearing people say the media. That would be like saying the shoes, right? Media is plural. So media has shaped and impacted the ways that we communicate with one another. So under the public screen, right, there is a lot of challenges. One of the biggest ones being that it can highlight divisions between people. We don't have 3 TV channels anymore. We not only have a lot of people who do not use channels. I don't have a TV channel subscription. We have streaming, we have videos, we have on demand, and so on, right? The way we're accessing media is incredibly different. The channels that we use, like social media, not only do we have things like friends and members and things that we follow or subscribe to, and not only do we have algorithms that target and help us to find things that appeal to us, but we also don't use the same forms, right? Some people will use Instagram or Twitter, some people will use Facebook, and so on. As a result of this, we find that our communication is a lot more divided in these mediated spaces. Even though we have a lot more opportunity to communicate, we're not all using the same apps, right? We're not all friends with everybody or having the same modes of communication. This can be an issue as well because media has the ability to frame how issues get talked about. So if you take a course from Dr. Chen in media ethics, right? One thing you'll probably look at is the idea of framing and agenda setting. You can think about media, and for instance, the way media would talk about a topic as kind of like a picture frame, right? That there is stuff that is within the frame that you get to see when you're checking your headlines, right? As an experiment, right? If you checked the news headlines for like the top 5 news headlines for Fox News versus MSNBC versus CNN, you're going to get very different results, right? Because of what's included in the frame, issues that are deemed important or worth discussing. So also the way that those things are talked about, right? There's a lot of different ways that, for instance, crime is talked about in news headlines in a very racialized way. That oftentimes the story, right, of a white collar, middle-class white person who committed a crime is talked about and framed in media very differently than a Black teenager, right? So there's a lot of challenges in the ways that mediated communication impacts information we have access to and the way that we talk about issues. So one thing that's talked about in this article that I want us to explore and use as a jumping off point as we get into our next class meeting is the idea of the Narrabee Gas Project This is the case study or extended example that this week's reading gets at in order to understand and think about political divisions. It's also something that I want us to take a little bit of time to explore and to better understand as a group. That'll help us heading into Wednesday and Friday's class. So what I'd like you to do is I will be asking you to work into some groups, but I do want you to take notes and turn in individually your work for attendance for today. But I will let you work with other folks, including people that have access to tech, like phones and so on, to look up and to explore this. First of all, take some time to explore what is this gas project? You know, at a core level, what is it? What is it about? Using either things like an internet search or through your look through the reading so far. Start to look at who the different parties are in this project and how some of these parties might disagree with one another. And then lastly, start to look at some of the ways that some of the parties in this conflict are communicating with one another. What are they doing? How are they expressing their views to one another? So we'll do a group for the Zoom folks, and let's do, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Zach will have you join them as a group of 6. We'll have folks here on this side as a group of 6. We'll also have the Zoom folks. Again, you're welcome to discuss and work together, but I will ask you to write your notes on this individually. So go ahead and create the breakout room for the Zoom folks and give you an opportunity to get started. So I'll give you a couple more minutes. Go ahead and wrap up the current thing that you're writing or typing. All right. So just want to do a quick overview of some of the things that you might have taken away. So regarding this first question, what the gas project is, I'd like to hear from somebody from this group about what they learned or discovered about what this project is.
Well, it's a natural gas project, and the reason why the government, and it's a moneymaker for Santos, and then the government wants it because it'll provide like over half the like natural gas needs for the state. So like, it's a good project for like other parts of the state that aren't affected by what I forgot what it was called, coal steaming or something will do to the groundwater. Like,
Sure.
they're not worried about that as much as like they need the natural gas.
Yep. So this is a question of natural gas, right? Distribution of natural resources. This is an Australian case study, right? Where it's a look at these kind of opportunities for natural gas, but also concerns surrounding the use of these resources. We've seen similar discussions surrounding, for instance, the Dakota Access Pipeline, some of the resources in Alaska and so on, right? These kind of ongoing disagreements and debates regarding how resources might be used. Let's hear from somebody here in this group about the second question. What were some different parties or groups that were found in this project that might disagree?
I was just looking at the different news headlines that were there. When I saw more money to Denver gas has been almost $1 million made
Uh-huh.
versus one that says fund their futures hourglass.
Hmm.
So just two very different political perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Nicole, right? I really like the idea, right, that not only are there different perspectives on this, but as you mentioned, right, you're talking very differently and framing this issue in a very different way. And kind of connected to that, let's hear from somebody in the Zoom trio about what they noticed about how different parties or groups were communicating with each other on this topic.
The only thing I could really find from that, just because it didn't say it directly, was that I think it was Millie who said that.
You're cutting out a bit there, Destiny. It's okay. We will have you all talk a little bit more about this in the next class, since it sounds like your reception is maybe a little bit spotty, and that's okay. We'll continue this discussion. But we'll be looking at thanks, Destiny. We appreciate you doing what you can. Thanks for that. Again, this is a good starting point for a discussion.
Yeah.
A little bit about this project, a bit about listening in the public sphere, how we use listening. Again, I like to use
Malia
rules and information
that
to read through the article. I recommend doing that. If you haven't done so already. Next class, we'll look more specifically into these divisions, how they connect the idea,
probably from
including the work we did.
obviously don't agree
Go
with
ahead and email or fast forward today.
the project and
Have a
then
great rest of your day, and that's me. Hopefully we can hear from you more fully soon.
can you hear me now?
I